potentially some people would go to places just in order to post a picture from that, or they would go to concerts just in order to, you know, take a video and kind of tell their friends that this is the case. Do you think there is any adverse kind of effects connected to that, or is this just where the society is going and there is nothing wrong with being a kind of PR agent of yourself?
I think there's something that potentially gets lost, which is what my wife refers to as being in the moment. Mm-hmm. So the work that I do at Wimbledon is quite intense, and I go through what I think April to June my wife refers to as the delay period, because she'll ask me a question and at some point she'll get an answer which may or may not relate to the question that she first asked, and that's because I'm so consumed by what I'm doing that I'm not in the moment. I'm not experiencing what's going on around me, whether that's, you know, my kids wanting to play or whatever it is. And I think that trait is becoming more prevalent with people in general, when, you know, a lot of how we consume and interact now is through a digital device. We spend a lot of our time looking down at something, not necessarily looking up and putting it in our pocket and just going, it is a lovely day. Or even if it is a lovely day, I want to tell everybody it's a lovely day.
Yeah, to know that it's a lovely day.
Yeah, and you know, you can go and see, I think there's some classic photos, you go and look on the internet of things like people in St. Peter's Square in Vatican City, there for a Vatican Mass, and you take a photo of, you see a photo of that from 20 years ago, and it's everybody sort of in the moment experiencing it. If you take a photo now, 50% of the people in the crowd will have the phone up, and they're videoing the experience. And partly that's because they want to capture that memory, partly because they want to share, but that translates into, you go to a festival these days, or you go to a music event, a lot of people will be in the moment, but experiencing it through a screen that's in front of their face, not dropping the screen and seeing what's going on behind the screen. And that's, you know, a trait of modern society, is that people are beginning to get more self-worth through how other people experience them and interact through digital media.
And then what about in your work kind of in sports and media and entertainment? You can also see that shift, I mean, quite clearly. Yeah. Do you change the way you, for example, approach, you know, and we're going to get into the nitty-gritties of Wimbledon a bit later, which I'm looking forward to very much, but do you change the way you approach the consumer side experience of a sporting tournament, having those in mind, you know, people experience it through the phone? Do you try to kind of embrace that, or do you try to bring it more kind of old school and trying to get people off the phones, which might not be commercially the best?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately any business has got to think about what's its audience, what's its consumer want, and if you're not tailoring what you need to your consumer audience, then, you know, you're going to fail. There, you know, if you look at the British high street at the moment, there's been a lot of failures in the last 12 months, 2 years, because people have lost focus on what is important to the consumer and aren't able to differentiate themselves. You know, sport is no different. You know, ultimately they're selling a product. The product is 2 people batting a ball over a net, or it's 11 people running around after a piece of leather, or whatever it is. It's a product that's got to be sold to an audience. So if you forget and you're not tailoring what you need to your audience, then you're going to lose out. And I think the challenge in sport is there's a huge proliferation of content and product, and there are very different ways to consume it. Whether that's physically at the event, or whether that's in a bar with your friends, or whether that's at home watching it on the television, or whether that's consuming it live or via catch-up on a train. There are multiple different ways that you can consume the product, and I think that is a particular challenge in sport. There aren't many other businesses that have that demographic spread and location and geographic spread with the levels of competition. So I think that's one of the things that I find fascinating about sports business, and the technology component of it is so varied. You know, you've got to cater for somebody who's 8 and 88 all at the same time in multiple different locations, which is quite challenging.
What about then, let's talk a bit about the kind of geography of it, because what I feel is that maybe there is some case to be made that people are not as much in the moment, but then I think on the flip side, in net, there is much more positive gain in terms of the scalability of an event such as Wimbledon, or such as rugby, or anything of that nature. You know, any big sporting event now can potentially have the reach of people who have never even been interested in this sport, but just because of the way they do their digital and how entertaining it is, or how educational, anything along those lines, you can actually reach very, broad audiences and potentially in different countries. Do you see it the same way? And do you think there is potential for sports to gain new fans and then for them to kind of become active participants through something like social media posts or just interest in digital content?
Yeah, I mean, the use of digital has transformed a lot of sports potential.
Can you provide an example?
So if you look at what the BBC are doing, for example, with their sports rights, if you looked at what they had on that was free to air via the BBC a decade ago, and you look at what they've got now from a broadcast perspective, very, very different set of rights. What they have done is partly that's been a financial thing. Their budgets have been squeezed. Partly that is because there's a lot more competition in the marketplace. So social media platforms are streaming. Amazon obviously come into the market quite recently. You've got Twitter that would live stream. You've got Facebook that are doing it. So the competitive landscape is a lot broader. But what the BBC have done, which I think is quite interesting, is they've taken a step back from a traditional linear production approach, media production approach. So whilst they've got free to air, they've also got their digital platforms. And increasingly, the digital platforms are taking over as a focal point for some of their new rights. So women's football, what they're doing with what we'll call, I don't want to use it, it's not a derogatory term, but more minority sports that they're starting to stream through their BBC digital platforms, so you can go and access those there. And I think that's going to be really interesting, particularly in the sphere of women's sport, because that's a lot of where they're focusing is on those sports. The rights fees are much smaller. There is a significant interest, and I hope what that will do will allow those sports to grow. So through more visibility of those sports, through seeing the quality of them, more commercial partners will get on board, more people will want to get engaged. My fear in all of it is that just because you're seeing a sport doesn't mean you're wanting to participate in it. And there's a real challenge, continuing challenge in most countries, I think, which is how do you continue to drive participation and an uptick. Say, tennis in the LTA is a good example. Should have been riding the crest of a wave of Andy Murray and Johanna Konta and so on, getting involved in the sport, but they haven't seen a corresponding uplift in their base people coming out and playing on Saturday.